as the title suggests, we're going to cover the Northeast markets. In particular, we're going to look at where HUD is seeing concentration. And then from there, we're going to talk about the changes to the Chapter 7 of the map guide. I will say we were hoping to have a representative from EMAD with us today, but unfortunately, Patty Morose is unable to make it. So she had some slides, but we're just going to skip over that. And my name is Cortney Mauldin. I am a mortgage banker at Berkadia. I'll introduce the panel. Right here on my left, we have Patrick Dieter. Patrick is a senior underwriter in the Baltimore field office. He joined HUD in 2016, and prior to that, he was a real estate market analyst, I believe at RPRG, specializing in feasibility and economic impact analysis. On my right, I'll start with Bob Levenfeld. Bob Levenfeld is the founding principal of Real Property Research Group, RPRG. He has over 40 years of experience in the field of market research. He serves as the chair of the National Council of Housing Market Analysts, but they are heavily involved in the draft Chapter 7, so we're glad to have Bob. Scott Allen here, directly on my right, Executive Vice President of Newmark, Knight & Frank, Valuation Advisory in the Buffalo office. Scott is a 33-year industry veteran specializing in valuation and market analysis across a broad range of property types. So with that, I'm gonna hand it over to Patrick, and he's gonna give us an update on the Northeast markets, or his particular markets in general.
Okay. Thank you very much, Courtney. Thank you, everybody who is still here. Before I get started, I want to pitch this is America's Rental Housing 2020. It is from the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University. They put it out every year for data nerds like myself, particularly housing data nerds. It is a page-turner must-read every year. I highly recommend you go on their website and read it. It's has a lot of things that we're seeing. The data plays out a lot in their academic research. It talks a lot about workforce housing, and I have been referencing it to a lot of lenders in concept meetings, and I cannot say enough about the work that they do. I am just going to go through, if you were at the Baltimore Coffee with Lenders back in the fall, you saw essentially this presentation. It's been updated a little bit with some of the additional concepts and activity that we've seen since that time. But I just want to talk about essentially the markets that we've seen that have been very active over the last 3 years, and particularly in the last year. And then kind of connect some of the interesting demographics that have played out over the last decade and just tie it all together. So this map is essentially, this is all of the concept activity for new construction that has come through the Baltimore office since fiscal year 2017, which is when I started at HUD. And just to clarify, the Baltimore office, our region, or our section of the Northeast region covers DC, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, and Delaware. Due to workload sharing, we end up doing deals. We can do them throughout the region. I've done a number of them in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, but typically, for the most part, if you're doing a new construction, the priority is to have that processed in the Baltimore office. So as you can see, the biggest one here is to point out is the purple dots, because that was the last fiscal year 19, which ended September 30th, 2019. I've got some updated stats on things that have happened since then, but this one is just kind of gives a 3-year trend to show that I don't think this will surprise anyone to see where a lot of the new construction proposals have been. it's, Washington Metro and then that 64 corridor basically from Charlottesville down to Hampton Roads just has blown up. So just by state over the last 3.5 fiscal years, we really have seen, we had high time. When I came into HUD in May of 2016, we were doing 2 to 4 concept meetings a week. It was, and most of them were in Washington. So if you can see, in that year we did concept meetings for upwards of 14,000 new units, and that has dropped pretty precipitously over the last 3 years. But the percentage in Virginia has just been rocket fuel. And in the 5 months that we are into the fiscal year of 2020, you can see for 2,700 units that we have listened to as proposals in our region, 2,500 of them have been in the state of Virginia. So there's still land. The land is still cheap, it is still available, and people are still ready to build in Virginia, particularly in Southern Virginia. I guess Central Virginia, Central and Southeastern Virginia. The new construction proposals, so this one, I like to show this one because, people say, oh, HUD, you just turn everything down. And, sometimes we do, and when we do, I just like to say it's for good reason. And I think that plays out here. Just the fiscal year 2019, that we have a data lag here, so a lot of things that were proposed in 2019 haven't actually come in yet. They're still being underwritten. They're still being baked, so we don't have good data for that yet. But if you look at the 2 prior fiscal years, we had, we're inviting 9 out of 10 concept meetings that we hold for new construction deals, and then about half of them come in, and we approve between 75 and 80% of them. So that's a good ratio to me. I think that means the underwriting's getting better. HUD reviews are doing a great job. That's a good metric for me, and I think that I was surprised to see them that high, and I'm really kind of proud of that. So.
Quick question on that, though, Patrick. So the 20 to 25% that are not approved in advance, what ratio of those are related to market issues?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'm going to give you the best HUD answer. It depends. And it depends on the market that they're in. I would say 50%, this is off the top of my head, 50% market. And then probably 25% mortgage credit and 25% environmental, but that's just off the top of my head. Just give an update on just see where Metro DC has come in over the last 3.5 years. When I got to HUD in 2017, every single concept meeting was in either DC or just outside of it. And I'm only slightly kidding, but not much. And as you can see, it was all throughout. We had a lot of proposals on the southeastern waterfront, up into northeast, up along the Rhode Island corridor. It really filled out, and then that market kind of took off on its own and chugged along, and HUD kind of said, you know what, the FHA product might not be the best thing for it right now because it's tough to, due to a number of issues, including data lags and just kind of uncertainty with rents that just kept rising and rising. And, there were a number of issues involved. And over time, we've actually seen, we had, I guess in 2018, we had a single proposal in DC. And it was, if you look, it's that orange one, it's up in Northwest. So it's in basically the strongest real estate market in an already strong real estate market. So it's, land is tough. It's tight. It's expensive. Zoning issues can be prohibitive, but in the last year we saw it come back in the new kind of southeastern market. We're constantly, lenders are constantly asking, is DC a no-go at HUD? And the answer is no, absolutely not. But it does need to be the right deal, and there's a lot of different dynamics to that. So,
Patrick, this pattern, though, reflects your footprint.
correct.
And it doesn't necessarily reflect multifamily development,
Cor-
obviously.
Correct.
And I think part of the reason is there's less HUD activity in Northern Virginia and DC is that the conventional market is addressing those at high end.
Absolutely. So I don't know if anyone is familiar with Edward Tufte, who is an information visualization expert, but I would fail his course if he saw that I put this slide up. He basically says, don't ever put a table up in front of a room. Sorry, professor, but there's so much going on here that I didn't really, this is just the easiest way to do it and then talk through it. Because it shows some of the the demographics and market dynamics that we've seen in DC, at Metro DC, not just DC. And I think it's played out very interesting in a lot of what we've seen. And I don't want to walk through every single thing here, but I think one of the biggest, there's an enormous difference between what has happened in market dynamics, market demographics, and renter income trends in the last decade in Metro Washington. And there's a huge disparity between what's happened in the city of Washington and the surrounding counties in suburban Maryland. I did not go as much into Virginia because we just have not had a lot of FHA activity in Northern Virginia. I'm sure that they probably look similar to the suburban Maryland ones in a lot of respects, but because we haven't seen a whole lot of activity, I didn't feel it was as salient for this conversation. But I think one of the interesting things here is that DC has just gotten, and this is not going to come as any surprise, but you're seeing, these huge growth of households, and particularly renter households, but the thing about DC that's kept up is the incomes have kept up. So if you look on the bottom, the top is the income, or I'm sorry, the household growth in DC, Frederick County, Montgomery County, and PG County, and you're seeing big renter household gains in Frederick and Montgomery County, which is not surprising. You see really significant gains in Washington DC as well in the city. But the interesting thing is if you go to the bottom table where you see the incomes, and these are adjusted for inflation. So this is one thing that I really like when I read market studies and review is to see incomes that have been adjusted for inflation, because a lot of times I will get them and they'll say the incomes are up 30%, and you look at particularly in markets in high rent markets. You say, incomes are up 30% over a decade, but if you adjust them for inflation, you'll see sometimes they're flat, sometimes and sometimes they've declined, as we'll see, as you see in Frederick County and Montgomery County. With the rising level of renter percentages, you've seen, I would assume, people getting priced out of DC into these counties, and renters typically have lower incomes, lower household incomes, and they have the overall median household income in Frederick and Montgomery County declined slightly. I would say, that's essentially unchanged. So there was no household income change. But look at Washington D.C. It's went up 3%. And then if you look in the second column, you see median renter income over the decade, essentially, and it was going up it went up 19.6% over the decade. But median rent went up 22%. So they're more or less they're keeping up. And if you see on the third column, and you get into rent burdens, which, so these are households that are spending more than 35% of their household income in rent. And it went down in DC. So that means you have a lot of very affluent renters in Washington who have moved there in the last decade. And I don't think that's going to come as a huge surprise, but it plays itself out. It actually does play itself out in the data. Conversely, you've seen lower income renters get pushed out into the counties, into Frederick and Montgomery. And if you look at that far right column, the rent burden greater than 35%, it hasn't really changed. So it'll be interesting when the decennial census data comes out and see how it plays out. But I was very surprised to see, as we see these underwritten rents skyrocket in Washington over the last decade, that the rent burden for people who are heavily rent burdened has actually gone down. And that's because there are so many people, what I assume is a lot of lawyers making a lot of money in Washington. So I'm Metro Richmond. Metro Richmond has just been booming on all cylinders. We've seen, we had an enormous amount of proposals, both downtown and western in Chesterfield County and Midlothian. When I got to HUD, it was basically when I got to HUD in 2016. We were either doing a concept meeting for DC or for Chesterfield County or downtown Richmond, and that is a function. The Chesterfield County one, from what I understand, is a function of the zoning relaxation. They had a change in their proffers on per door proffers, probably 5 or 7, maybe 10 years ago now, and that just opened a floodgate there. And it's always been a high demand housing area with prohibitive zoning for multifamily, and when it got cheaper to develop multifamily there, it went gangbusters, and it still is, from what I understand. And that is one of those things, and Bob can talk about this. I think he struggles, or can struggle with it, is how do you, there's a data lag there in terms of, you see renter household growth that's obviously there. It's played out in absorption rates, but it may not come out in a demand model. And those are the things that we understand in the Baltimore office, in our region. And we will, like I said, markets are dynamic. It depends. And, and Bob's market studies are good, and they show that. And, those are things that we can talk through, and when they're adequately presented in an application, we see, what is a negative 100 demand analysis, we're not going to say, no, it's dead, because there's some nuance there. And particularly, markets are dynamic. That said, we have seen a considerable amount of drop-off in the proposals that we've gotten in downtown and western Richmond, and actually seen them shift to Henrico and Hanover County, which I think also has a function, a little bit of zoning. From my understanding, Hanover County is starting to relax their zoning a little bit. Is that? Yeah. Okay. And so, it's really, we'll see that play out. And I lumped these together, and then I'll do the really the tables, the demographic and income tables after this. So this is Hampton Roads. This may be a little bit difficult to see, but generally, if you're familiar with the region, you can kind of see. It's Hampton Roads. Virginia Beach has just been extremely active over the last 5 years. It continues to be. It keeps defying absorption models. It keeps defying absorption rates. It's just been Norfolk kind of hit a point where it took a little bit to absorb. There was a pretty big oversupply for a little bit, and it's balanced back out. So we are starting to see proposals come in for Norfolk again. So if you thought if that last slide was going to get me an F in an information visualization class, this one's really going to bury me. I put both of our Virginia sample on one, and there's just a couple takeaways, and I don't want to harp on this too long. These are basically the three main spots we have seen as high activity in our office, in the Baltimore office, have been the Charlottesville area, Hampton Roads, and the Richmond area, that I-64 corridor. And they're all a little bit different. Charlottesville is interesting. I lumped that together with Albemarle County because there's not really any land left in Charlottesville City. And so Charlottesville City, from what I understand, it is what it is. It's tough to grow anymore. It's built out, unless it's going to be infill. Albemarle County, on the other hand, has been booming. It's probably going to continue to boom. I'm always, when I hear about target markets, and you say we have all these people, empty nesters downsizing, I'm suspicious of that in a lot of markets. Charlottesville is not one of those markets. I've looked at the age distribution trends. There are older renters in Charlottesville. There are people who are retiring there and moving into a rental apartment. That is a legitimate target market in Charlottesville, and it's also in Suffolk in Hampton Roads. Just see. So So Suffolk City, the Hampton Roads has been interesting, and I've called certain things the Suffolk City effect. You can see Suffolk City, and I'm assuming this also has to do with some relaxation of zoning, probably cheaper land for the region or for the general area. 4.5% average annual household renter growth over the last decade. That's huge. The renter base has grown by 36%. At the same time, the median household income for renters in Suffolk has gone down. So what that says is that basically Suffolk is one of those, it's a market where you really have an affluent renter base who is coming into this market. It's an interesting concept. It's something we haven't seen across the entire region. And so it kind of goes back to, this really to me says there's a deficiency of workforce housing in here. And I do think it's, we're going to be struggling or working, I guess, working towards defining what workforce housing means, because I think that Suffolk and a number of the other markets down in Hampton Roads are kind of playing out that you're seeing these kind of a bifurcated market of a very low end and a very high end, and nothing in between. And particularly nothing new construction in between. So I'm happy to take any questions on any of these. These slides are available. I can take them now, or we can do it at the end.
Yeah, we can take questions. Sure. And also I would like to just remind everyone, if you want to send your questions anonymously, just send them through the app, and I'm happy to read those. But any questions for Patrick?
Just a point on the demographics that Patrick's put together. Looking at the average annual change, and you see the significant growth of renter households, what you don't see here is the fact that in many of these jurisdictions, can speak into it. Okay, I'm sorry, I wasn't speaking into it. You see the growth in the renter households. A key item in many of these markets is that 80 to 90% or 100% of the net new growth in these given areas are renter households. Not necessarily in a suburban market like Frederick, where it's still a significant home ownership market, but in many of these markets, certainly in Northern Virginia and some of these in the Richmond area, and especially center cities areas, you'll see, rentership accounts for 120% of the growth, and home ownership has actually gone down. So that's another dynamic that impacts this.
For sure.
Okay, any other questions for Patrick? All right, I think like I said, we were hoping to have an EMAD update, but we're not able to do that. So now we're going to move to Bob to talk about Chapter 7. And let me just...
See, the good news is this year Patrick is doing market, so I don't have to talk about the market as the stock market implodes. Instead, I'm going to be talking about the revisions in Chapter 7. As we did in 2016, again, the National Council of Housing Market Analysts, including Scott and I, as the review of the MAP guidelines started going through, we had discussions with lenders, we had discussions with HUD, and we provided significant feedback in terms of the MAP guidelines for market studies. We've gone through a number of back and forth with that, and what I'm going to go over today is the major changes or additions to the Chapter 7 draft guidelines that were posted on the draft board on February 12th. And we sent back comments on February 28th, and I think it came off the drafting table, the draft board, on February 29th. So there is a color key to this presentation, because I don't want to claim to talk from HUD. So the burgundy on top is the section in which the comments are referred. The black headings is the proposed wording of the Chapter 7. The strike-through is deletions that NACMA has suggested. The blue are proposed additions that NACMA has suggested, and the gray are commentary on those changes. So we want to be very careful. HUD has been very receptive to our comments, and we thank them for that. We'll see what comes out at the end of the wash.
One quick question, and it's not a loaded question, but just so Bob and I know as we go through this, have the underwriters, originators, anybody in the audience been able to review, or have you taken a look at Chapter 7, or not yet? I know they're throwing these chapters out like crazy, so there's a lot to review, but I see some heads nodding. But
We'll tell you what's important.
Yeah, I mean, so what Bob's going to identify are the major key changes here, and if I have a chance at the end, and we probably will have time, I've taken a look at some of the appraisal modifications too. It's a little tricky, but we did redline it, so I think we've hit them. But that being said, if you guys have any questions or issues with any other aspects of Chapter 7 that you've seen, throw your hand up so we can let you know if we're trying to address that.
Compared to me, who's a pure market analyst, Scott is ambidextrous. He's a market analyst and an appraiser. So the first item is sort of a clarification of notes that had come through since the 2016 version. It's the effective date. And the effective date has been defined as the date of site inspection or the date in which the analyst completes his or her research activity. Unlike an appraisal where the valuation is the date of the site visit, the reality is a market analyst typically goes to the site at the beginning of the process, and truly the most effective, one of the more important pieces of information is the pipeline. So we like, which comes at the latter part of the research. So we feel the effective date is more realistic at the end of that research period. The effective date now cannot exceed 30 days from the site inspection. So if you stop us midstream because something's gone on and we've gone on more than 40 days, we might have to go back and revisit the site. And still the effective date pre-application is with 120 days of the pre-application package. And the date for a study for the firm commitment application, which we'll talk about in a minute, which we've actually defined, must be within 180 days prior to the issuance of the firm commitment. And I'm not sure how that works between the date it's submitted for firm and it's issued, but I'll let you guys work that out.
Bob, one thing on your bullets, I don't know if you want to comment on the last sentence that they added related to the update letter through the waiver. You want me to just read that?
Well, why don't you let me go to the update letter?
Oh, do you have that?
I do.
Oh, okay.
Limited scope market studies. Not enough. I think Bob Burley gave it this name, so it's a little. Update letter is a lot easier, but limited scope market study. NACMA proposed adding a definition. All you guys call us and say, well, we've done the study for the pre-application, you're going to firm, and HUD wants an update. And then we have to define what that is, and we go back and forth. And we started doing letter updates, I think, in the Baltimore office, where we said, you don't need all 120 pages. The site is pretty much the same. You really want to understand the changing dynamics of the market. So we've defined this limited scope market study at firm commitment. Limited scope update may be requested focusing on updating demographics and competitive analysis, updating the net demand and the effective demand analysis, and a discussion of the proposed properties of the subject's proposed rents in the current competitive environment. So it's addressing the key issues without updating all the contextual information. The hospital hasn't moved, the shopping center typically hasn't moved. Certainly in the update, if the shopping center has closed, that should be referenced in the update. So now we have a definition of what a limited scope market study is. Did you have something to add to that?
No, we're good.
Okay. See, if you were patient, you wouldn't. All right. Okay, this is the bugaboo. So this is in black text, because this is what the current language is, and it's still under discussion. The question is, what rents should be used in the market study? And there've been two schools of thought about this. One school is that the market analyst should work totally separate from the appraiser, sort of a Chinese wall, and come up with some number, and then it's up to the underwriters to reconcile those numbers in terms of rent. The issue with that, from NACMA's vantage point, or from my vantage point and NACMA's vantage point, is that if you're doing that, you're not conducting the effective analysis of capture rate and penetration rate, and more importantly, you're not opining on absorption based on the rents of record. So the alternative approach is for the market analyst to opine on rents to the lender. However, in the final report that goes to HUD, that report should reflect the market rents of record, and the capture rate and penetration rate should reflect the rents of record, and the absorption should reflect the rents of record. So if we work sort of in that Chinese wall environment, it's creating a couple of layers of activity, because if the market analyst does a separate report and the appraiser does the separate report, the underwriter has to reconcile the two of them. Then we probably have to go back and redo the reports based on what the final reconciled rents are. Most market analysts and appraisals, we don't have vested interest beyond this study, and our reputation is certainly worth more than any given study. So, I think we've been successful in interacting with appraisers as we've gone through this process and reconcile it. And if the rents are higher than the market analyst says, we say the rents look aggressive in this market, and given that aggressive price position, this is what we think the absorption is. So the current draft, again, has this language in here. It's still under discussions. Tom Berniziak is very aware of this, and is going to continue discussions with appraisers, HUD appraisers, to see if we can nail down that language.
So when you are doing your evaluation, would you be preparing a 2273 like the appraiser would?
Well, that's what we're trying to avoid.
Right.
One of the key items that we came up with the focus groups in 2015 for the 2016 is that nobody wants dueling grids. And certainly, we can torture grids to confess just like an appraiser can. We have the skill set, but we can arrive at rents without going through that specific grid. And I think there's a different, the market analyst, focuses on different things than the appraiser. And when I'll speak for my firm, when we're doing pricing, we're looking at sort of average pricing per bedroom and how that fits in the market. And the appraiser is looking at detail, model to model, and in a detailed analysis, appraiser might go outside the market and make adjustments for location and whatever. So we think that it's a workable system for us to approach it in two different ways and then sort of reconcile without the market analysts coming. There was verbiage in here to derive derive a separate estimate of market rent, which we as market analysts objected to strenuously, because certainly in the affordable world, when we see estimate of market rent, we say grid. We've suggested language that says we'll comment or evaluate the appropriateness of the rent rather than using that phrase.
Yeah, and just to add to that, specifically what it says is the market analyst must evaluate the rents for the subject and must provide a separate estimate of market rent. So our sense on that was it's getting pretty close to saying the market analyst also has to do the 92273, which we're trying to avoid.
Any other thoughts about that? Steve, all the way out there. The appraiser has as I understand it now, the appraiser has the prime responsibility to derive rents. We're all probably starting with the developer's rents, which we all know doesn't work. The way RPRG operates, I won't speak for the entire industry, but I think a lot of people in the industry, is we'll do our rent analysis and we'll call our lender and say, these rents are crazy, or you know what, there's room here in these rents. But we will wait until we get the appraisal rent. If we see a red flag, we're going to tell the lender, and the lender will talk to the appraiser, or we'll talk directly to the appraiser and say, you really think these rents make sense? So there is that interaction. But at the end of the day, it doesn't seem to make sense for us to generate a report with our separate rent, have Scott generate a report with their separate rent, and then we have to reconcile, and then we have to go back and redo both of the reports. We don't want to charge you the extra time. It seems like it takes extra time and extra money that is unnecessary. Anything else? Patrick, you have any thoughts? No. Okay, good.
So I guess just one more sort of addition to that, and one of the things that I'll comment on is, Bob and I see some market study work, but not all market study work. You guys see more than we do. HUD sees more than any of us when it lands on their desk. So I'm not sure to what degree every market analyst has historically identified or evaluated rents. We tend to talk about them a little bit more than Bob's group might, simply because I think it's part of our training as appraisers to sort of think that way. So we do go probably a little further than some others, but we don't, do the 92273s. I think that's, going to get very inconsistent, and it's a little bit problematic. But the market analysts are going to discuss and touch on it, and I don't think there's any issue with that. It's really just a fundamental question of how the language is worded in the guide that, a little tweak to that I think would be perfect. When the word must is in there a couple times, I think it's going to cause some issue. From an underwriting perspective, I don't think it'll be a good thing. You're going to have a correlation between the market analyst and appraiser no matter what if you have dueling grids in the reports. I see that as an issue.
Current 74K1, current housing market conditions. And for those old timers before the map guide in 2016, I think the last version was in the 1900s or something, 1970s or 80s, in which basically the guidelines didn't even reference the market analyst to look at rents. It was just looking at the demand factors. At 2016 and in this version, reasonably and justifiably, HUD wants two views of the rental market. It's one of the reasons they want the appraisal and the market analysis to be done by separate professionals. So, we think this is important to continue to be in the market study guidelines. we suggested changing the verbiage. Again, the verbiage had been the estimate of current competitive rental inventory of both single-family and multifamily units in the PMA, with data by the number of units by structure type, number of bedrooms, rent levels, year built, and location. I think what they were getting at there is trying to understand the for-sale market and the scattered site market. What we suggested is breaking this, changing this focus to look at the competitive inventory of professionally managed rental communities, and then we suggest adding in those markets where it's appropriate, where there isn't a significant inventory of professionally managed rental inventory, provide an overview of the scattered site rental market that might compete with a subject property, including the types of structure units available and rents. So it's sort of quantifying, instead of just looking at the for sale market, it's really defining specifically those scattered units that might compete with your multifamily property. The net demand analysis, again, we worked very diligently to sort of outline an approach for net demand. This is the first among equals in terms of analysis. That's what everyone wants to see. And again, the net demand is looking at renter household growth, rental trends by tenure breakdown, percentage of net households that are renters, replacement due to demolition, conversion, or shifting of something that I lost, and also the effect of any current excess vacant supplies based on an estimate of the balanced market vacancy rate. Again, this is basically accounting for a very tight market where there's not enough vacant units to have elasticity in the market, or a very loose market where there's excess vacancies. We've had some creative underwriters saying, well, if HUD is underwriting from a financial basis at 93%, shouldn't we be analyzing the market from a market vantage point at 93%? Our contention historically has been if a market is at 7% vacancy rate, there's some fluff in that market that should be accounted for, regardless of what the financial underwriting is. So we're suggesting that at least reference that typically it's assumed a 5% vacancy rate in a market in the net demand analysis. And I can point to you chief underwriters who beat me up on that, so I'm getting it in the guidelines. Newly added by HUD, if there is an excess supply in the market, and we're not going to talk about if there's an excess supply of 10 units or 100 units or 500 units, that's the subjective judgment, and that's what you're paying your creative market analyst to make that case. But they newly added, HUD is going to ask for impact of demand on occupancy levels. So if there's excess supply and this project is, and the subject project comes online, what will be the impact? Comment on the potential impact of the net demand conclusions on future occupancy levels in the market by the end of the forecast period, especially if net demand indicates supply and demand are concluded to be imbalanced, or especially if net demand indicates supply and demand are concluded to be probably supposed to be unbalanced. So that's another step that your analysts should be doing once they've done the demand calculation of trying to figure out, given the numbers that you're coming up with, what impact that's going to have on the market. I'm not sure how that's going to work out, but obviously in 2 years, when we've had a lot of experience, we'll tell you exactly how we do it. There was verbiage in here. The study should also include the estimate of the absorption period needed for the project to reach sustaining occupancy based on the current market data and the quantitative and qualitative, which we didn't understand what those terms meant, so we suggest net and effective demand estimates as the key factors that impact absorption. And then there was the verbiage of sustaining occupancy is defined as having sufficient income to pay all operating expenses, monthly debt service, escrow, and reserve for replacement requirements, none of which the market analyst has any information as to what's being assumed, because we generally don't get into operating expenses. So we're suggesting changing that verbiage to sustaining occupancy may be defined as the market's typical stabilized occupancy level. All right, and the last component, during our interaction with HUD, we said that typically we're requested to do commercial studies, but we never exactly know what HUD is looking for. And the initial verbiage in the draft stated that the market analyst shall acknowledge and describe the presence of the commercial space. The description should include the size in square feet, number of projected or actual units, along with the conclusion specifically as to how this space complements the residential portion of the project. A more detailed analysis will be completed by your map appraiser. And we had some concerns about that, given that the commercial components are typically in more complicated and complex submarkets, and understanding we felt, and many of our lenders who called me when they saw this, understand the demand of of the retail component is beneficial. We're not sure how we could conclude how the space complements the project without a thorough understanding of its use and its position in the commercial market. I don't want to say it's going to complement it if I don't think it's going to lease up and it's going to be an empty shell. So what we have proposed is suggesting a scope of service that might be appropriate for a commercial study, which can, not exclusively, but can include information on traffic counts, trends in commercial vacancy rates and commercial rents in the submarket, inventory of commercial centers in the immediate vicinity of the subject, representative sample of rents presently available in the market, pipeline of commercial space, an evaluation of expenditures compared to the supply to determine rental gaps, retail gaps in the market, and an opinion of the commercial development's opportunities at the subject and the achievable rents. And that's probably not necessary for small commercial components of what we came up with as less than 5,000 square feet. And HUD has been receptive to those items and is actively considering those. So we might have a clearer definition of what's needed for that study.
We got a couple questions from the audience. Why don't we take those right now?
Okay.
First one, is a limited scope market study required by HUD at their request only under certain instances? If so, please provide instances when HUD would require a limited scope market study at the firm stage.
Well, I'm not going to talk for HUD. It's my understanding that that's requested at firm commitment. That's pretty standard operating procedure. Correct me if I'm wrong.
In our region, it's been pretty standard as long as I've been at HUD.
Yeah.
Okay. When observed absorption in a market exceeds the household growth shown by the demographic data, how willing is HUD to accept this seeming pent-up demand or in-migration? Any data specifically helpful to support this is any data specifically helpful to support this in an application?
Why don't we defer? Scott's going to talk about that, and we're going to go back and forth about that. That's a key issue. How do you justify the next new project in Baltimore City or Richmond?
Okay, and then just one more question. I think this is actually for you, Patrick. What areas in the Northeast does HUD consider overbuilt?
It depends.
Boy, you've learned.
No, and I don't say that flippantly. We've seen a lot of activity in certain parts of Hampton Roads that it's going to be a stretch for HUD to do certain things, but it's submarket by submarket. So if you look at what we've done in Virginia Beach, over the last 12 to 18 months, everything seems to have moved closer to the shore into a different submarket. So we did a lot in that kind of downtown emerging submarket a couple years ago. There's a lot that's come online, and now we're seeing deals come in more on the coastal side. So, you know, Virginia Beach is not overall overbuilt, but there are certain submarkets in Virginia Beach that I think that, you know, are worth a phone call to us before you start doing some preliminary underwriting and asking for a concept meeting. Same thing with some submarkets in Richmond. I would say if you are thinking anything in the Manchester section of Richmond, I would highly recommend you give us a call first. So I really think it's submarket by submarket. It's product by product. If you come in with if you came in downtown Silver Spring with 300 market rate units, we would probably tell you to save your time. If you came in with a 150 unit 231, we would probably say, sure, come on in, we'll have a concept meeting, we'll listen to it. So it's a dynamic process. Like I said, I put my contact information up there. You can call me at any point. I'm relatively candid, pretty approachable. So it depends.
All right.
So,
Scott?
yeah, we'll expand on that a little bit. And I think, it depends might sound, hedging is probably a bad word, but look, the reality of what we do, it does depend. We've talked about demand models, and that's on my screen here. And Bob and I, through our time at NACMA, in that group, we've had a lot of discussion on demand models, not HUD specific, but whether, as an organization, we want to have a standard demand model. I'm going to talk a little bit about the process that we go through as analysts when we evaluate, and a lot of the factors that come into that. And Patrick's term is correct. I like it. It does depend. And I think what he's saying is that in the reports, as HUD making a decision on a particular project, they're looking for the market analyst to really show them the variables that are particular to that market and that deal that will allow them to make a proper decision. And that definitely depends. Every time we go into a deal, every time we look at a project, there's different variables that have to be evaluated. Things that you need to think about. I mean, affordable housing is different than market rate housing. The way that we look at demand and the way that we use the HUD guide is going to be different when we look at that. Every time we approach it, it's a little bit different. To us, and I know Bob, the way he works, one of the key things with being able to get to a supportable conclusion on a deal is communication in this process. So, I teach the HUD MBA, one of the appraisal classes, and one of the things I always do there is bring up the variable that is important to remember, that we get into this deal long after you guys know everything about it, long after the developers have worked already years to get it there, and we have, well, I have 4 weeks, Bob apparently has 6 weeks based on his timing, to figure it all out. So that's a real short window for these projects, which are highly complicated, markets that are highly complicated, and think about all the variables that go into that. So, I mean, we got to move through it, and communication is going to be the key. Part of it's the data that you give, but part of it's communication with the lenders, with the developers. We're not going to communicate with HUD personally on it, but we need to know from you sort of what sense you're getting through your meetings at pre-application to firm application so that we know how to sort of read that. Why is that important in regards to this slide? So we're not going to go through and prove whether one model is better than another, whether net demand is better than effective demand. The study that you get will show and should show both in all cases. Ours do, I know Bob's do. In my personal opinion, and going back to the question, and we'll talk about it a little bit, is that effective demand really evaluates a lot of the market-specific components that at the end of the day, I think are generating what the development group might be looking at. Net demand is a key conclusion. There's a couple issues with it, though, and it was hinted towards in that question. It is, as you people that work with it know, it's very heavy on household growth and existing projects / pipeline. So that's fine, but I know, working in the Northeast regions, many of the areas that we work in over a 3-year time frame, which might be the typical forecast period, you're not going to see significant growth to overcome planned, proposed, or existing projects. It's just a reality. Even in some of the more dynamic markets, the demographic data that we have available, when you start breaking it down, just isn't that significant. So there are going to be holes in that model. And that is where the "it depends" comes in, because you need to evaluate whether or not a negative number, parentheses, around that demand is cause for concern. And it very well could be, and it should be considered. It's a red flag, however you look at it. But it's only monitoring, really, household growth and a few other variables compared to what's out there in the supply chain. And how the analyst breaks that down sort of after that page becomes important. That model, too, and Bob and I talked a little bit about it earlier. Bob and I have kind of worked on a lot of projects together, and we talk about things all the time. And the way we do things are probably pretty similar on the net demand, but they're different. The way I handle certain variables is different than Bob. And, we might agree to disagree on things, but, again, we don't see the studies that you do or that go in the HUD. So part of the communication is to, let us know when we're coming in as your analyst as to what you're seeing. We think we do things right. Bob thinks he does things right, but there are variables that can be subject to discussion. There really isn't a better way to look at it. Again, like some of the breakdowns in the effective demand, that does not mean it's more reliable. There is no magic number. A 10% capture rate doesn't mean one project's going to work and another fail. It isn't a number. There is no such thing in my mind. It has to prove. And I think what Patrick's looking for is, from cover to end, does your study really demonstrate that there's support for that project so that the right decisions can be made? That was kind of a long answer to that question, wasn't it?
Well, just to supplement that answer, again, the foundation of the net demand is the household growth in the short term. And if your market study just shows you that they ran an Claritas run, and they show you the number and put it in the back of the report, that's not doing a market analysis, and that's really, I think, the answer to that question. Yeah. That Esri or Claritas or local projection has been done, based on data that was reported a year ago, based on activity that was reported 2 years ago, that might have a political consequence because it's a local housing projection. And your analyst should be evaluating what's going on the ground, and does that match up with the activity that's being projected for a 3 or 5 year period. And if, as the question asked, if you've had 4 deals that have absorbed 100 units each in this market over the last 2 years, so you had 400 units of net growth, of net rental growth, and the projections only show 50 units of growth over the next 5 years, that should be questions, and that should be built in to the projections, and your analyst should be explaining that so that we can justify why the projection should go beyond what came out of the data service. So, from our practice's vantage point, that's where the rubber meets the road of trying to understand the dynamics of the market and let this model reflect that.
So we touched on this briefly, and yeah, I won't throw it out there. I did talk to Patrick a little bit before, and I think in his office, the way that they look at it, parentheses around the net demand does not necessarily throw the project into the garbage. I think, again, it does raise some certain red flags, but be careful with this. The net demand model has its weaknesses. We've gone through some reports recently where we've recognized those. Certainly when you're analyzing affordable housing, I think shifting to that effective demand where you could look at income brackets and how many households fit the specific tax credit or Section 8 tiers becomes more important. I don't know if it automatically fires off a rejection from HUD. I don't think it does, but we've heard some rumblings that it's not good to see. Patrick, I think you said it doesn't, at least from your office's perspective.
It depends. If you come in with negative 800, I hope you have a ladder to dig yourself out of that hole, or to climb out of the hole you just dug. Negative 100. Yeah, Bob said this I've now known Bob for almost a decade. I think it's getting there. And he says, a negative 100 is pretty much a balanced market. We're not that good. And I actually think Bob is very good. And so, when you come in with a negative 100, there's a lot of room in there. Like you said, you could have 9%. You could have 9% projects in your pipeline that are not going to compete with your project in any way, shape, or form. And so it depends.
Yeah, so a couple case studies, and I think I'll focus a little bit on Jersey City because I was looking around. I don't think the people I did that work for are here, so I can talk about that. But it's a unique market. I will tell you, one of the things I did before I came here was run the HUD finance screens to see if HUD's actually done any deals in the area that we were working in, and I noticed they hadn't. So the fact that we concluded to a negative demand in this study of 4,000, minus 4,000, might be one of those reasons. Now, the odd part about that to me is that when I see that number, yet look around, we surveyed probably we actually used a very small market draw area to try to, evaluate the minimization of the impact, because there's just thousands of units proposed. I think if you look globally at Jersey City, it was something in the neighborhood of 10 to 13,000 units on the books. I think Aaron helped me with the sheets. We had 8 pages of proposed projects. So we broke it down. Household growth was showing in that small PMA 17 plus 1,700. Pipeline was 6,000. So I mean, do the math. I mean, it's going to be a pretty big number. The market, though, from the projects that we surveyed, there was a little bit of struggling, but on average, they were running 96% when we spoke to them. The range was 90 to 98% for the projects that we reviewed. No concessions, technically. Lease-up was running at a couple of the new ones at about 25 units per month. So the reality was that certain projects in that area were working adequately. Yet, the conclusion that I think we drew out of that was this is not going to be a market that HUD's particularly going to be interested in, I don't believe, because there's just too much going on. And that might raise their bar for potential risk variable factors. But it is an indication of a large negative demand in a market where projects are succeeding. We explored some of the things like Bob talked about, looking at different variables there. Employment growth is obviously strong, but it wasn't strong enough to overcome that. It's a hard market to read demographically to put a PMA around because most of the people moving there are coming from somewhere else. So to evaluate that gets a little bit complicated. We do beat it up in different ways, and we talk to the lenders and the developers as we go through that process to give them alternatives to say, here's why it might work, and you can keep trying it in one platform, but you might have to look at a different financing platform. So, in that case, I think the negative impact might have been too large. But.
I just want to jump in terms of that analysis, and I don't know exactly, I'm not completely familiar with the Jersey City market, but one thing that we've looked at in markets like that, there's an IRS data set of zip code to zip code movement over years that I have found to be extremely insightful in some urban markets. Particularly, I've used it in the Richmond market. and it explained, it was quite telling. So just throwing that out there, it's a data set that can be used.
Well, without making, not asking you to speak for HUD, but just speak as an analyst, and we've worked in Jersey City also, and faced the same consequence, and in other markets. So what I would tell my client if I saw, you know, an active market where projects are absorbed, you know, 5 projects are absorbing 30 units a month, but there's an excess supply of 4,000 units, I would say, you know what, this is probably going to be a good project. This is a solid market, has good underlying fundamentals. And it isn't that if you introduce one more 300-unit project, it's not going to lease up. But the risk isn't worth it for HUD. They don't need market share. The private market is taking care of it, and they're not going to be receptive to that. Is that a reasonable interpretation of how you would look at it?
Yes.
Just real quickly on pipeline, and this kind of goes into what Patrick just mentioned. One of the, not issues, but one of the variables that you got to watch when you read the net demand model is that, again, if somebody modifies what is being included or considered, then those numbers are going to change around. So if Bob looks at it purely based on the, you know, bullet points and the variables in there, what Patrick's referring to is a variable that we can bring in, but if that enters the net demand model, then that's kind of changing the dynamics of that model. Okay, so sort of on the right side of the analysis. And pipeline's sort of the same way. I mean, one of the things to consider in pipeline is, you know, how competitive are those units coming in? I know in talking with lenders and developers, that's always a little bit of the frustrating situation because, you know, if a project simply has advanced to the talking stages with the community, is the analyst or should the analyst really evaluate what the timing is or the likelihood of that project hitting? It is something to consider. And, you know, are you really breaking that pipeline down? If you're in, you know, we did a deal in Pittsburgh and one of the new construction projects had a focus for a short period of time on student housing because of a shortness of student housing. So if they're coming in, even though it's a market rate deal, but over the first 5 years of their useful life, they're going to have a contract with you pitch. Should you really include that in the pipeline? Those kind of things you need to break down and look at pretty closely. Do we evaluate similarly? I think indirectly. We've talked about that enough. We do and we don't. There are a lot of variables that can differ. One of the ones you need to watch for is PMA. That is something that, you know, if somebody's looking at a primary market area a little bit differently, you know, and inevitably, even though Bob and I might agree on all the variables, we might interpret the PMA differently by a few census tracts. So you might get differences in the way things look or feel. And as I indicated, we don't see the number of reports that you or HUD sees, so we do need that communication and bounce back so that we can continue to evaluate it. Are each of the offices being consistent? I think, you know, from my experience, they do try really hard, but I think at some of the meetings, you might hear something different here than there. I think, you know, in a nice way, maybe we need to communicate that to HUD. I don't think they're trying to be inconsistent. I think in my working with all the HUD folks, they want to be consistent, but people do form different opinions and look at things differently. So again, back to the communication to make sure that we know how everybody's evaluating things. And then real quick, just some other factors, you know, job growth. Bob and I talked about it a little bit. This is a real hard factor to kind of equate into what it means for demand of apartment units. There isn't a great variable, and those, you know, the forecast in job growth is an indication as to what might happen to household counts. The demographers do formulate that and book that into some of their statistics, but they're always going to be a little bit behind on that. If a new employer is announced to come in the area, there's no way, you know, Esri or Claritas has integrated, you know, the Amazon headquarters coming into town next week that quickly. It will trickle in, but it needs to be evaluated. Census tract data by analysts, mobility turnover, that's sort of what Patrick was talking about, equating to turnover and movement ratios, affordable housing, and then changes in tenure and how these variables might create those shifts. I'm not going to go over this. We're out of time pretty much, aren't we? We're getting close. So on the appraisal end of it, Keep this, hang on to it. These are the main sections that I saw changes in, and we sort of redlined it. This, I think, is in the data that you guys have. Not the variable sections in there. The cap rate was a pretty significant change, I think, in a good way. The reconciliation was really clarification. Same with occupancy requirements. Other income, keep your eye on that. There were 2 comments related to the media revenue sources generated from cable and internet, and also cell towers. So like we've been saying for a while, HUD is starting to identify the risk associated with cell tower revenue, and I think we're going to have to evaluate how we bring that into play in our reports. Ground leases, that was ripped apart and redone, and I'll be honest, I didn't read it word for word, but I think we're going to have to. And I'm going to be talking to Tom a little bit about some of the variables in there. I know they're still exploring whether or not they've got that all the way they want it or not. So I would read that section sooner than later. If any of the lenders see anything that you want to comment on, I would say now's the time because it's still a little bit open. And then the remaining economic life, I won't go into that. If anybody takes the MBA class, you'll hear me rant about it. But there's no change there, unfortunately, from my perspective. And, we're still going to have to evaluate that the same way. That's it.
All right, thanks, Scott. These guys, we're out of time right now, but I think everyone will be here for the reception, so if you have some questions, track them down. I want to thank you all for listening. I could tell some of you were fading a little bit, or maybe you were praying with your head down. But it's a lot to hit you with, I realized after lunch, so I appreciate you hanging in there with us. I want to thank my panelists for all their hard work and participation. And I think you guys are just going to stay right here, and we're going to move right into the Office of Risk Management presentation. So just hold your seats, and we'll transition the stage. Thank you.